parents of the world, and actually everyone who cares about kids, like, we have a decision to make. Is this a world that we're going to accept for our kids? Or are we going to get into politics, onto school boards, get into the decision-making environment to change it, however that is done?
Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Natalia Marukfer at Restore Childhood, and today I have the honor of speaking with Molly Kingsley, who is one of the co-founders of UsForThem in the UK and has a new book out with her fellow co-founder, Liz Cole, and the book is called The Children's Inquiry. Looking at the impact of the pandemic restrictions on children across the United Kingdom. So here's Molly, and please introduce yourself and talk about your background a little bit, and then Molly's going to read an excerpt from the book for us.
I'm Molly Kingsley. I'm one of the founders of a parent advocacy group called UsForThem. We formed right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was May 2020. I met a fellow parent and campaigner on Twitter, of all places, and it would have been partway through the first school closures in the UK, so all the kids were out of school. We all had children. My kids were quite little; they were 3 and 6, so one preschool, one had just started school at the time, and we were all becoming very concerned about the length of these school closures. By then it was thankfully, already clear that COVID did not pose a serious threat to the vast majority of kids. So we had this very age stratified virus on the one hand, and then on the other, school closures, which, even for the kind of happiest and luckiest kids, it was rapidly becoming clear were just an absolute disaster. So yeah, we got talking on social media, and that's how we met. And the day we launched UsForThem, there were 3 of us, Christine Brett, our other co-founder, and we just started it with a campaign. The campaign said, get kids back to school, but do it in a way that takes account of their welfare, because the other thing we had going on at the time is, politicians were talking about getting kids back to school and what that was going to look like, and the beginnings of these very dystopian classrooms with kids socially, nothing social about it, is they're socially distanced, and perspex squares, and there was a photo at the time of a preschool kids who would have been really near the age of my youngest, and they were sat in a concrete playground in marked out 2 by 2 meter squares, and that's kind of what did it for me. So I just can't, this is just wrong. This is not consistent with a healthy childhood. And what are we doing? And who has thought about the kids here, and who is speaking for the kids? And that's when we launched, and within hours, days, the 3 of us had become thousands. And yeah, we've just carried on from there, really advocating for children to be, I would like to say, put first, but actually, often it's just to be considered at all in the pandemic response.
And what kind of advocacy did you guys do? Did you do rallies, petitions?
We've tried. We did a lot of shouting on the internet. We did, in the early days, we wrote a lot of letters. So to everyone we could think of, be that politicians, be it policymakers, the children's commissioner here, children's charities, like, come on guys, what's going on, because this is not good. And yet then we did petitions, we did open letters as time went on. We've made use of strategic litigation more than once. So we have threatened to take the government to court where we have thought there have been breaches of effectively children's rights. That's been quite an interesting, and I think probably quite impactful strategy for us. Actually, we've never actually ended up in the courtroom, but in your intro, Natalia, you talked about some of the restrictions being less here, and actually certainly with school closures, we were set to take the government to school to get schools back open with face masks, which I'm sure we'll come on to, which there was no evidence for face masks as an effective intervention for children, and there was mounting evidence of the fact they might cause damage and certainly impede communication. So that was another occasion in which we were set to issue legal proceedings, and at that point the government dropped the requirement for children to be masked. So and then
that's the difference between you and us. We're so disjointed with different states and cities and departments of health that once the CDC came out with their really vile guidance and now vile revision of their guidance, it just kind of gets dispersed like a virus across the country, and it requires thousands of hours of attorney time and organized parents and different districts and threats of lawsuits and actual lawsuits and finding a court that actually will hear it and in time and isn't compromised. Because some of these cases languish for months.
I mean, it's a really interesting point. So I think we've benefited from it being, I guess, to an extent, one nation, one set of rules. The only thing I suppose I would say is so when we first formed, actually, it was, we also had an UsForThem in Scotland. They're still going under a different name. We've got an UsForThem in Wales, Northern Ireland, Bermuda, I think there was one. So it grew quite quickly. And what we noticed is, although the detail of the rules was the same, so you're right, we wouldn't have been able to launch proceedings in Scotland and Wales and England, the underlying principles and the subrogation really of children's well-being and health to that of adults was universal.
Yeah, definitely. I guess what I'm saying is that the amount of time and money, I mean, I organized a lawsuit in New York City to reopen schools. That was only for New York City. That's 5 boroughs. There's, Westchester. In California, I have friends who are suing the LA County Department of Health over masks. I just saw yesterday that there was a victory of sorts in a lawsuit in the Fifth Circuit of Appeals in Louisiana. The ACLU had said that if there was a disabled child or an immune compromised child in any classroom, the rest of the classroom and possibly the school would be required to mask if that child's family so desired, to protect that child. I mean, think about that. Like, first of all, masks, I mean, we'll talk about them later, but I mean, just the volume of these cases and the variety and, in 50 states and many different municipalities, it's been completely dizzying. So it's amazing to hear you say this. I actually never really thought about whether you ever ended up in court or not. And you're an attorney, right?
Did it for 10 years or so, but I haven't done it in the last 5 to 10 years, but it came in useful, actually, the background that, I think in the early days we knew enough. We were very lucky that we have been found by lawyers along the way. So, there's lots of parents who are lawyers, and we have benefited. I think, we have to be very resourceful because we were just parents, and some of them have stuck with us, actually, for the sort of 2 years and still help us. And there has just been such a strength of feeling, I think, that what has happened to kids is wrong and mustn't happen again, actually.
I have found anecdotally that many of the moms and some of the dads who have been the most vocal advocates and the most effective are attorneys. Many of our Keep NYC Schools Open parents are attorneys. The people I work with out in California, they're all attorneys. They've been involved in legal challenges and continue to be. And many of them are running for school boards now. So I think that there's something to the legal training path that really kind of helps you become a very effective advocate, either one way or another. So I thought it was interesting when you told me that you were an attorney as well. I was like, oh no.
I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? Like, parents shouldn't have to fight for your, the right of your child to go to school. And I think it's probably thrown a lot of parents. And it's great to hear, actually, that parents are becoming active on school boards. And, I think that's something we could definitely learn, I think, from you guys, actually. We do need a new wave of parent activism within schools after this, I think COVID has brought out, actually, that the parent voice is missing, not only from policy making, but actually from schools often here as well.
let's have you read the passage, and then we can talk a little bit about athletics and what it was like, throughout 2020, 21, and what it's like now, just so we can compare and contrast with what our American kids and the blue areas. It's really not all kids, right? I mean, the one thing I'd like to point out is America is a huge country. And my husband, who's English, likes to point out that it's kind of more like the EU, where each state is its own country than it is one, unified country. And for instance, I was talking to somebody in Georgia a few months ago and trying to get her to help with some anti-masking return to normal initiative. And she said, oh, yeah, I'll help you. But I just want you to understand, and this was May or June of this year, 2022. She said, I just want you to understand, my kids have had a fully normal year. There's nothing going on in Atlanta. Like, they're not masked, they've had normal sports, they're playing, musical instruments, having their proms. We hear about what's happening in New York. It's not happening here. This is not the entire United States. This is blue America, and the bluer, the more restricted these kids are.
Okay, so this is an extract from the Children's Inquiry, which is the book that we wrote. And I guess maybe just before I start, like, the purpose of the book really is, we have been doing this for 2 years now, and we have a large network, as I said, of parents, but actually also of experts, advocates, lawyers, but also scientists and professionals who have, I guess, joined our journey really along the way. And increasingly, it's felt really important to get some of that down on paper. So I guess the purpose really of the book was to shine a light on what we had heard from parents and what we've learned about the failings really, which led to this happening. And this is just one of the first chapters of the book. So a photo circulating on social media in summer 2021 shows a scene which would have been unimaginable in 2019. In it, a row of small children, aged 4 or 5, line up holding hands. They're all masked. Behind them stands a row of adults, one of whom is the governor of New York. None of the adults are masked, and their smiles beam out at the camera. It is an archetypal example of the inversion at the heart of our global pandemic response. Over the last 2 years, the youngest members of society have often borne the heaviest burden of COVID restrictions, even though the risk from COVID increases dramatically with age. This has created a deep and seemingly perverse inequity between adults and children's lives, spanning contexts and borders. Indeed, it's become so ubiquitous that it risks becoming normalized. A little boy in Cumbria developed a mild cough and cold symptoms at school. Under the school's isolation guidelines, he was kept away from others in a separate space until a parent could collect him. In this case, that space was an outdoor shed-like building, doubling as a classroom. By the time his mother could make her way by public transport to pick him up, the 4-year-old was shivering with cold, and his hands were raw. In fact, he developed hypothermia. In January 2020, officers in Texas arrested a teacher for suspected of child endangerment after her son was discovered in the boot of her car at a drive-through PCR testing site. The mother allegedly told officials that she had transported her child in this way so she wouldn't be exposed to his infection. These distressing cases testify to something deeply dysfunctional in our societal response to COVID. We've normalized the mistreatment of children, collectively justifying it against the backdrop of the pandemic state of exception. This treatment of children should be unacceptable in any civilized society, no matter what respectability it's given by the cloak of public health. Much has been made throughout the pandemic response of the need for public health to act in the interests of an ill-defined concept of a greater good. Yet it's striking that a now re-engineered concept of public health has barely acknowledged children as part of that public. In its name, we have not only marginalized our young, but have often actively put them in harm's way. How is it that the US, UK, and most Western democracies failed this basic tenet of nature, systematically and deliberately placing our young on the outside of our societal herd and demanding they shoulder a burden that should never have been theirs to carry?
Thank you so much. I think that one other passage that really kind of leapt out at me, and this is something you and I have talked about a little bit, is the cancel culture and trying to intimidate parents and call them names to stop them from advocating. You say here, from almost day one of launching Us for Them, we've been targeted by unfounded accusations of misinformation, disinformation, being variously a shadowy front for dark money, anti-vaxxers, granny killers, even memorably killer clowns. The animosity of these claims has often seemed to increase proportionately with the level of publicity the campaign has attracted. That's so true.
And you know what, it's still going on. And we had an example just this week where UsForThem has applied for core participant status in the public inquiry. I don't know if you know, but we have a public inquiry starting quite soon, and you can participate in that. You can apply to participate, and as a result of letting it be known, and perhaps it's, you start thinking, was it a mistake? Should we stay quiet about these things? And, as a result of letting it be known that we had participated, we've done that as a consortium. One of our consortium members is the Anne Longfield. She was Children's Commissioner at the time of the pandemic. And that didn't go down well with our haters. And, we've just this week had another torrent of really horrid abuse and vitriol, and we're going to get them barred from the inquiry. And it's really 2 years in, you think, wow. And I think we've all grown quite strong, as I'm sure you have, about it, kind of used to it now. But actually what I think scares me is it puts other people off standing up. And this has been the problem, the intimidation, the bullying, the lies about you. Other people see this and they think, I won't speak up. And I think we've just seen that pattern consistently. And of course, it's all coming out now. I don't know how much you follow UK news, but, just in the last 24 hours, we've had a flurry of UK politicians acknowledging that, lockdown and school closures were a huge mistake. Not my mistake, someone else's mistake. But none of these people stood up at the time. But actually, if you look at the intimidation and the bullying of those few who did stand up, it's no surprise. And I think, in some ways we've been quite fortunate in that we weren't targetable, I guess, in the same way some professionals were. So, there's awful stories of professionals being targeted at work and losing their livelihoods for speaking up for children. I mean, it's just insane.
And it's still happening. I helped found the Urgency of Normal group, and we have so many doctors who faced, really severe consequences at work, on social media. Lacey McBride, who has been very vocal and talking about the mental health pandemic amongst children, and really it was one of the reasons why she really, put herself on the line by joining the group and being very vocal and writing op-eds and going on, CNN or whatever, has been targeted so viciously, and some of the others as well. You and I have been called anti-vaxxers. The stories are inaccurate, but they tend to conflate anti-mandates for kids with anti-vaccine, and all vaccines, of course. It can't just be one.
No, and I think that's one of the issues I find very interesting, actually. It's, it's the conflation of this one vaccine, which was, let's not forget, it's very different. It was under an emergency.
Can you talk about what it was like just walk us through, May or April 2020? When did we shut down in New York on March 13th, 2020. I think that's, or March 15th, they told us that schools were shutting down. I don't know what your date was, but could you just walk us through it?
When they closed schools around the same time, maybe a week later, that was the vulnerable children and children of key workers will still be able to go. That vulnerable child regime failed at least in the first school closures. So later data, and in fact, it wasn't even that much later, but by the kind of mid-May, it was known that I think 94% of vulnerable kids were actually out of school. I mean, obviously, everything we knew about child safeguarding just went out of the window. And there were tragically some high-profile cases associated directly with school closures. So children who had been killed at the hands of their carers behind closed doors during lockdown. So you had the school closures. I think alongside that, and I'm sure it was the same for you, all other children's services closed. So, you close our schools, but we also close social services, health services, mental health facilities, and more prosaically for all children, playgrounds. There were these crazy photos of playgrounds, padlocked playgrounds, do not enter, danger on like toddler swings. And I think, that immediately opened this really big gulf between people who had gardens and had outdoor space and had local, fields and things like that, and people who had none of that and were just stuck in their houses or in their flats for weeks and weeks on end with no ability to I guess, give their kids exercise or even just kind of let off steam in a very basic way. And I think whilst we can come onto it, but whilst in some respects our measures were less severe, I think in terms of the blanket nature of the societal shutdown, it was quite pronounced actually that, and there was no, you talked about athletics, well, that just disappeared for the best part really of a year, maybe even 18 months for kids. Things did get moving again by September 2020. Schools opened again, but it was it was disrupted schooling. And then they closed again completely in the January of 21 for 3-4 months. So basically until after Easter, I think. And then after that, the kids got back, but it was incredibly disrupted because by this point we had the testing in place. So kids were having to test, at least in secondary school, as a condition of going to school. And, anyone that had come into contact with a close contact was off school. So I think there was a crazy statistic that, at a time when in theory schools were open, 1 in 10 kids were actually perfectly well, but at home because they were testing positive or someone in their family had tested positive. So it was kind of like ping pong schooling for a good few months. And I think, the sport came back. It came back gradually. It's only now, what are we now? We're 2 years and 3 months in, and we are left, I think, with a legacy of degraded schooling. Actually, we've destroyed the sanctity of schooling. I don't know if you have the same there, but we have a cost of living, it's euphemistically called, it's really a cost of lockdown. So, the bill now has to be paid, and in many different ways, costs are spiraling out of control. We have high inflation, and schools are saying, and I have a lot of sympathy with them, that they're not going to be able to afford their energy bills. So we have talk of a 3-day school week from September. So, and that it wouldn't have been considered as a possibility 2.5 years ago. Why is it on the table? We've really done something quite fundamental, I think, to kind of give the impression that school is not critical. Of course, we know it is. The other kind of big legacy thing, I think, is just in terms of what's missing is a lot of the sport and extracurricular, which was just cut altogether. You couldn't sing, you couldn't play instruments, obviously, for 1.5 years or a year. And a lot of that is still to come back. Some of it may not come back because a lot of it is dependent on out of school groups. Many of them closed during lockdown and, just financially weren't able to make that work.
As you know, in New York City, almost 400,000 kids still can't go back to normal after school athletics. They can't play musical instruments or participate in band or any kind of high risk activities. I think they're high joy activities. And then we have our mayor saying, oh, violent crime is up, but there's nowhere for kids to go after school. And if they're going to school in the first place, because attendance rates are down as well.
Yeah, so, it's exactly the same here. And it's something we talk about quite a lot in the book. The phrase, I don't love it actually, but the phrase that's used is ghost children, these children. And again, it's it's 100,000 children, I think, in the UK that have just fallen out of the school system.
So who do you think is responsible? We've seen, the CDC has done a really terrible job. It's been totally politicized. Our CDC guidance is written by the teachers' unions. Our American Academy of Pediatrics has been a spectacular menace. It hasn't protected kids. Actually, it's been a predator on kids and made kids' lives so much worse. They're still advertising that masks are not harmful to infants' development and that kids do not need to see faces. Who do you think is responsible?
Ultimately, government. And it's very interesting. We are at the beginning, I think, now of a very unedifying battle here, where government ministers who, ultimately made these decisions blame the scientists. So we have advisory boards of scientists who, thought, it seems like, in very narrow terms, and COVID became this huge risk to the exclusion of everything else. But ultimately, who makes the decisions? It's the ministers are the ones making the decisions, and there has been, I think, a huge failure of government and governance, where in the time that we needed these protections most, particularly for children, they just disintegrated, they evaporated. And I think alongside that, you have a third sector organisation, and I include that loosely to include organisations, probably aren't third sector, actually it's probably more part of the establishment in the estate, but organisations like the equivalent of your American paediatrics. Here we have the Royal College of Physicians and Child Health. They have been stronger, I believe, here, and they have belatedly, I think we would say, they have been quite good. So they certainly haven't been predators. I think that would be very unfair. I think we felt we reached out to them in the early days when it was literally just UsForThem, this organization of 3 parents, no money, like no policy experience, just, we're just going to wade in there. And we asked all these people to stand with us, and would you, particularly the big children's charities as well, like, hi guys, do you want to add your voice, your advocacy to us? And just nothing at all. So we became quite disheartened with organizations like that. I think this was a systemic failure. I think whether it's because people felt they couldn't speak out, I think at first there was genuine fear, a whole different kind of worms, but there was a terrified population, and the virus was perceived to be of significant risk, I think, to everyone, rather than now, of course, we know that actually the virus is very discriminatory in who it's most likely to be high risk to. And maybe that wasn't as known at the beginning. But I think you also have a whole maze of conflicts. You've got funding conflicts. You've got a lot of these charities, a lot of organisations that are in some way funded by the state. And of course, what we saw was the state went rogue. But how can these people whose bread and butter depends on, in some way, not criticising the state? They're dependent on the state for their careers and then their income. And I think that makes it very hard to stand up. And it probably also means that people have some kind of blind spot. Actually, you don't want to think that the person that's funding you or the person that's employing you is doing this awful thing or very damaging thing, whether or not deliberately, is not the point. And it's hard to think that actually that might be the case. And I think there's a lot of people that should have spoken up that just didn't speak up, and actually still aren't speaking up about some things, because although some of the issues impacting kids are in the past, let's not pretend that they all are.
Yeah, funding is a problem. It is not a mystery what it takes to have kids and adults, remain healthy and live good lives. We look at blue zones across the world. People eat healthy food. They don't live in food deserts. They live in food pantries, and gardens and eat fresh, whole food. Our school food is a disaster. It remains a disaster now with all the budget cuts. I shudder to think the direction we're going in. We all know that kids need a ton of activity. There have been research study after research study about how much movement kids have missed and lost over the course of the pandemic. And we are now, instead of creating these incredible fitness programs and maybe looking to Germany or Scandinavian countries for how they keep their kids fit, we're restricting them and stopping them from moving. It's really astonishing.
It is astonishing, and we've just going totally the wrong direction. And I mean, I don't know how you will have a perspective on this, but I think we here have come to a view: no one's going to do this but us. No one's going to fight for kids. No one's going to put them first. No one's going to fix this problem. And I think we are at a point now. I know you and I have talked a little bit about this separately, but I think where we are at a point where, parents of the world, and actually everyone who cares about kids, we have a decision to make. Is this a world that we're going to accept for our kids? Or are we going to get into politics, onto school boards, get into the decision-making environment to change it, however that is done? And I don't see another option now, because I feel very sick of begging for things that should have been a right. They should have been never needed to have been said. I'm not begging the government to not harm my child again. Like, that trust is gone. And these people are not going to put children first, because were they going to do that, they would have not acted like this, and they would have done it a long time ago. And we would be talking about recovery and healthy food and, play parks for children and better urban design. And we're not talking about any of that stuff. And I just think those of us that care about kids need to get real at this point about what the future needs, what needs to happen to get that on legislative agendas globally.
I think we need to plan a trip. I was just thinking this last night to the Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Sweden, and talk to them about what they did right, because I feel that all we're doing is trying to undo terrible things, but we're actually not doing anything.
No, we're not making progress. We're not. So let's hold that thought, because I think we should do that. And there's a few, yeah.
One last thing, because I know you have to go. Can you talk about masking kids in England and how that went? Like, were they masked?
I mean,
were
don't get
children
me
masked?
No. So, and I would say, look, it's really hard to attribute, you never know in this, do you, whether your advocacy has influence. But I think if there's one area where I feel maybe UsForThem did have influence, it was in this conversation, because masking was a thing for kids. So it was of course, it was never going to be for kids, Oh, and then suddenly they had to wear masks in school corridors, on public transport, and it's all very incremental. And then the big moment, the kind of penny drop moment for us, because we actually believed that, a British government wouldn't do that to kids. This was in our naive days. And the penny drop moment was then, of course, when the mask mandate was introduced for secondary school kids in classrooms. And I think that was just, I think for me, actually, personally, that was the moment at which I lost all faith in and all trust in this government. I was like, this is just so wrong. You can't mask kids in an education, or you can't mask them at all, and you can't do it in school. And actually our Conservative MPs, and actually the Prime Minister himself, that many of them, Prime Minister had been on record as saying, we won't mask them, it's nonsensical to mask children. And then a few months later, here we were. And so we fought, and I think we, parents fought as if their kids' lives depended on it. Actually, just, we will not accept this intervention for children, we will not do it, and don't you dare come down to primary school children. And that was the point at which we launched legal proceedings. Lots of other people made a lot of noise too. It was definitely not only us. And we did get the masks off the kids. They've never dared to, well, they did reintroduce them once. So we did the same again. We were like, hi, that court case, it's back. This time we actually got some of our politicians to back that court case too, which was quite a big thing. Such was the depth of feeling. Like, there were policymakers who were very angry about it too. And then it was dropped again, and that was earlier on this year. So I feel like we're in this very odd hiatus, actually, where, life is back to normal and our kids aren't masked, but there's never really been an admission that they shouldn't be, or that we wouldn't try and do that again in a similar situation. So, hopefully they don't come back. But again, I don't, at this moment in time, I would stop short of saying I was totally confident of that.
Right, it's always hanging over your head, right? Hanging
over your head. They've done it once, and they've not said we'll never do it again. And even with school closures, actually, we should probably talk about that. They have, so increasingly senior cabinet ministers have said that school closures were a mistake, and they say things like, of course, I can't imagine we do it again. And one of the MPs here has introduced a private members bill, which is a way that you get legislation tabled. And so this MP is chair of our education select committee, and it's weighty voice to add to this. And he has tabled an essential infrastructure bill, which basically says, it recognises the reality that schools are essential for children. And I think our kind of comment to any minister who's going on record say, of course we'd never do it again, it's like, well back that bill, let's make that a reality, because actually that would be a wonderful start of a legacy for the children who have suffered so much in these 2 years, to actually recognize that it was wrong, that it couldn't happen again. And actually it would at least put schooling on a stable foundation then, which it's not now. So
yeah, I think that would be really important across the world, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to show the book again and advise people to, buy it and read it and talk about it and share it. This is a time for reckoning, and as you know, Restore Childhood, which I started, is making a documentary series about what happened to children and what the state of kids is now, and just trying to preserve the stories so that we remember what we did and don't do it again and undo what we've done. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. No, thank you so much for having me on, and we will look out with really, we'd love to see the documentary when it's available. So yeah, just thank you, and thank you for all you're doing. And yeah, and let's carry on talking, because I think there's a lot that could come out of this, a lot good.
Yes. Thank you, Molly.
Yeah.